Hello everyone, welcome to From the Star Wars Library, where Star Wars is in print, the Force is with the readers, and we are taking a trip again back to 1979. I'm your host, Nathan P. Butler, and this time we take a look at the Star Wars newspaper strips. Now, this is something different beginning in 1979. We had the Marvel comic series. We'd had a couple of books by Del Rey, Splinter of the Mind's Eye, and the novelization of A New Hope. Now Star Wars enters another venue for expanded universe-style storytelling. The Los Angeles Times newspaper syndicate got the rights to produce a Star Wars comic strip. Now, these were going to be syndicated, serialized stories. So, of course, this would show up in a lot of different newspapers across the United States and eventually be republished elsewhere. And you'd have basically one little comic strip each day until finally you had an entire story. This ran from 1979 all the way up to 1984, and while most of the time people think of this as something that was a project by Archie Goodwin and Al Williamson, who are probably best known for this series, it didn't start with them. The newspaper strips actually began in March of 1979 under a man by the name of Russ Manning, who had had a long and storied career up to that point already. This is actually one of the last things he worked on prior to his death while suffering from cancer. It's actually what causes it to switch over to Archie Goodwin. We'll deal with that a little bit more when we get to that point within this series. When I say comic strip, I essentially mean something like this. This would have been one day in the newspaper. Just one line taking up basically the same amount of space as, say, Garfield, nowadays Foxtrot, or whatever else is in vogue at this point as far as newspaper strips go. And that was it. And then the next day you get a little bit more. Next day you get a little bit more until finally you had that entire story. And they started off pretty ambitiously, actually, with the story entitled Gambler's World. Well, sort of Gambler's World. They actually started out with that and a story called the Constancia Affair. Because initially, when this series first started in March of 1979 under Russ Manning, they had two stories going simultaneously. The first was called Gambler's World, and it was airing, or being released, I guess not airing, it was being released on Monday through Saturday of each week. However, the Sunday newspapers, and a lot of people only subscribe to Sunday as opposed to the whole week's worth of newspapers, the Sunday papers were airing something different. That was the Constancia Affair. And also, while Gambler's World was being released, we also saw the Sunday release, or Sunday serialization of a story called the Kashyyyk Depths. Both the Constancia Affair and the Kashyyyk Depths will get their own episodes in the near future here for From the Star Wars Library. For those of you who want to check out Gambler's World at this point, this first Star Wars newspaper strip, it was given the classic Star Wars treatment by Dark Horse Comics. When Dark Horse got the license for Star Wars Comics, one of the things that they did was they took the comic strips, merged them together, added a little bit of expanded artwork, sort of reshuffled the panels just a little bit, got rid of some of the redundancies, and used it to create a new comic series in color as opposed to black and white. The first time they did this was with the Goodwin and Williamson strips, just called Classic Star Wars. We'll deal with that much later on. But in 1994, they took these early adventures, most of them, not all of them, but most of the early adventures by Russ Manning, and also put them together as a comic series. The comic series became known, appropriately enough, as Classic Star Wars, The Early Adventures. So the story we're looking at here, Gambler's World, appeared in 1994 now. Classic Star Wars, The Early Adventures number 1, Gambler's World Part 1. Classic Star Wars The Early Adventures number 2, Gambler's World Part 2. And then, of course, Classic Star Wars The Early Adventures number 3, Gambler's World Part 3. Again, all being essentially reprinted, going from being something that was in, just to give you a quick glimpse inside here, from something that was in comic strip form, maybe 3 panels per day, to something where it's, in most cases, 2 panels side by side, just kind of running through. This wasn't nearly as elaborate of a classic Star Wars recoloring and rejiggering of the panels as was the original series by Goodwin and Williamson that was retooled by Dark Horse Comics. One thing that is of note in this is the introduction of the character seen right here. That is Black Hole, and we're going to come back to him because that is probably the most significant impact of this series. So what do we have with this? Essentially, Luke and Leia and the Rebels are going to all these different planets trying to get in touch with local leaders to get more support. They wind up going to the Gambler's World, very much like the Wheel to a degree, called Vorzid 5. It's a place where there's all kinds of gambling stuff going on. It's an entertainment place, but the money that gets made goes to the Empire. And the Rebels, in this case Luke, Leia, C-3PO, and R2-D2, wind up going to the planet to make contact with local rebels. They do so, and use that connection to try to get in touch with someone high in power who supports the rebel cause. Turns out that it is the president of the planet. And while they're trying to do so, you get some side adventures. C-3PO and R2-D2 at one point get separated from Luke and Leia. They wind up being attacked by a sort of a kid gang, think West Side Story, called the Freelies, who are trying to take them over, or trying to make them their droids. And they wind up having to fake having another master at one point, very much like the droid that we saw back in Silent Drifting, Marvel issue number 24. It's really kind of a goofy little story, but amidst all of it, the Imperial agent who is sort of trying to get Rebel spy secrets from the Rebel agents and from Luke and Leia at one point is Black Hole. That is where this issue really stands out. Before we get into specifics about that character, Black Hole, which is the biggest impact here, let me note here that while this is 1979, they managed to handle the characters in a much better fashion than we saw them handled in most other materials of this era. I mean, if you look at the Marvel series, I've already pointed out how Luke looks like, freaking Tarzan or something with his hair. Chewie does not look like Chewbacca. It's a pretty poorly done art style by Carmine Infantino and the other people working on the Marvel series in the same era. However, here, Russ Manning, who also does the artwork, he writes and does the art, is showing Luke really as Luke. C-3PO looks like C-3PO. Leia looks like Leia. The only trick to it is that they're wearing the same things that we saw them in A New Hope, as if somehow they don't have another wardrobe, so Leia's in the buns and all that kind of stuff. Now, I'm not a big fan of how cartoony the artwork is in here. It looks like something you'd see on a Saturday morning 1980s type of cartoon, or among many other comic strips of the time in newspapers, but it is what it is. It's a newspaper strip. It's going to have newspaper strip style artwork, presumably, but at least it's much more accurate artwork, if not as detailed, than what we see in the Marvel Comics series. So that it definitely has going for it, with Russ Manning here doing double duty, writer and artist. It's not a very impactful story, except, of course, for the introduction of, as I mentioned, Black Hole. Who is Black Hole? Where it starts out here as this odd Imperial agent who shows up as this sort of hologram that looks like there's a star field within him. Star fields play an odd part in this story. At one point, we're going to wind up seeing within the rest of classic Star Wars, the early adventures, star fields being used as maps born by an illness. It's a little weird in an upcoming story called Tatooine Sojourn. But in this case, what we've got is this hologram of the outline of Black Hole with all these stars and stuff in it that makes him look kind of eerie, and we don't really get a lot of information about him here. We also had, at one point, in the, I believe it was the second edition of the Game Master screen for the Star Wars role-playing game from West End Games, there's mention of another person who is an Imperial agent named Lord Kronall. We also get a mention in the Dark Empire sourcebook, I believe it was much later back in the, or up in the 90s, for a character named Lord Shadowspawn, who also gets a mention in the Essential Chronology. Well, through various methods, throughout various little source articles, some of which were published, some of which weren't, and then were abandoned, but then some concepts came back, all these different approaches being taken by people like Dan Wallace, Abel Pena. Eventually, later on, in the modern EU era, all these different characters get sort of mushed together. Black Hole, Kronall, and Lord Shadowspawn, they become one individual. Black Hole was Lord Kronall. Black Hole is essentially his code name. He's also known as a self-styled Lord Shadowspawn. He's also said to be a prophet of the dark side, a group of characters that is introduced in the Paul and Hollis Davids books known as sometimes the Jedi Prince or Trioculus saga in the early 90s. It was of questionable continuity standards at one point. So there's a lot of different things that get mushed together to take this character of Black Hole and make him something more than he was when he first appeared back in what we think of as issue 1 of Gambler's World. That character does come back. Thanks to a brief mention of a conflict with Luke Skywalker in the Essential Chronology, we eventually got from Matthew Stover, Luke Skywalker and the Shadows of Mindor. And in this novel, set just after Return of the Jedi, Luke is fighting against Lord Shadowspawn / Kronall / Black Hole. So an enemy in one of the more recent Star Wars books to focus on this particular New Republic style era is a character that actually began back in the newspaper strips back in 1979. Rather interesting how that character made his way into the future. Unfortunately, the story in and of itself in which he's introduced, not all that interesting in and of itself. A lot of these newspaper strip stories were very blah, as we're going to wind up seeing. So, broadly speaking, Gambler's World. Is this story essential? Can it be skipped? Well, basically, it's not essential in any way, and it can be skipped. I was going to say that maybe it's essential if you want the background of Black Hole, but not really. I mean, he appears here, but there's not really much to his appearance in this story. He's just kind of there as this weird enemy, and that's about it. So, can you skip this story? Absolutely. Is it essential? Absolutely not. But if you're looking back to something where early Star Wars EU, obscure Star Wars EU for that matter, newspaper strips, not even the Marvel series, had a chance to impact something in the modern EU era, look no further than classic Star Wars The Early Adventures or the newspaper strips for Gambler's World. With that being said, thank you for watching, and may the Force be with the readers.